Before Egypt rose, before pyramids touched the sky, there was a world that vanished without a trace. A civilization so advanced that later cultures remembered it only as myth. Atlantis. Ancient texts whisper that this world did not simply collapse, it was abandoned, and one being carried its knowledge forward. Thoth, not as a god of Egypt at first, but as a survivor of a forgotten age. What if Egypt was not the beginning, but the continuation? What if Thoth arrived carrying the final wisdom of Atlantis, knowing humanity was not ready to remember its past? Tonight, we uncover the world before Egypt fell, the connection between Atlantis and Thoth, and why this knowledge was buried beneath time itself. Stay with this story until the end, because what was lost once may never return again. Atlantis was said to be a city of impossible brilliance, its harbors filled with ships that glided across oceans, its towers gleaming with geometry that mirrored the stars. Its people believed themselves eternal, convinced that their mastery of science and spirit placed them above collapse. Yet pride is a fragile crown. When the seas rose and the earth trembled, Atlantis drowned, not only in water, but in its own arrogance. But wisdom does not vanish with stone. It lingers, carried by memory, disguised in myth, preserved in silence. Thoth, the eternal scribe, became the witness of this fall. He gathered fragments of Atlantis's knowledge, scrolls of geometry, tablets of cosmic rhythm, myths of cycles, and carried them across collapse. He was not a ruler, but a guardian. His task was not to dazzle, but to endure. Egypt became the vessel of this endurance. Its pyramids aligned with stars. Its temples disguised wisdom in ritual. Its myths carried warnings across generations. The ibis became a symbol of clarity, the serpent of renewal, the lion of strength, tempered by wisdom. These were not decorations, but echoes of Atlantis disguised in form. The Hall of Records, hidden within Egypt's silence, became the chamber of memory. It was not treasure, but warning. It was not spectacle, but preservation. It was not loss, but endurance. Thoth sealed fragments of Atlantis within stone and sand, waiting patiently for humanity to rediscover humility. And so, the story begins not with Egypt's rise, but with Atlantis's fall. Egypt was not the first, but the continuation. Thoth carried wisdom across collapse, preserving fragments too vast for pride to grasp. The world before Egypt fell was a world of brilliance and ruin, of pride and silence, of wisdom disguised in myth. If you love mythology and history from all cultures and forbidden ancient stories, subscribe, because this channel reveals the secrets behind every myth. And let me know from where you're watching, whether it's from your couch, your bed, or hiding under a blanket, pretending you're in a secret archive yourself. Atlantis was not born as a simple tale told around fires. It was remembered as a city of impossible brilliance, a place where geometry was not just mathematics, but a sacred language, where harbors stretched across oceans and towers gleamed like mirrors of the heavens. Its people believed themselves chosen, convinced that their mastery of science and spirit placed them above collapse. They charted the stars with precision, built monuments that echoed cosmic rhythms, and whispered of cycles that bound all things. The legend of Atlantis grew because it was too extraordinary to be forgotten, yet too fragile to survive. Later cultures remembered fragments, a flood that swallowed cities, a trembling earth that shattered temples, a civilization so radiant that its fall seemed impossible. These fragments became myth, but behind the myth was memory. Atlantis was not simply a story. It was a warning disguised in legend. Its brilliance was matched only by its arrogance. The Atlanteans believed eternity belonged to them. They mistook knowledge for permanence, geometry for invincibility, silence for emptiness. Pride became their crown, and when the seas rose, that crown dissolved. Atlantis drowned not only in water, but in its own vanity. Yet the legend endured. Across cultures, whispers of a lost world appeared in myths of floods, in stories of gods who abandoned humanity, in symbols of cycles that repeat. Atlantis became a memory carried in silence, disguised in story, preserved in fragments. It was remembered not as a city alone, but as a lesson. Civilizations collapse when they forget humility, when they misuse wisdom, when they chase power without balance. The legend of Atlantis is not meant to dazzle, but to remind. It whispers across ages that brilliance without humility is fragile, that silence preserves what pride destroys, that balance sustains what vanity consumes. Atlantis lives on, not in monuments, but in myth, a memory disguised as legend, waiting patiently for humanity to rediscover its warning. Atlantis was not simply lost to the sea. It was deliberately erased from the memory of humanity. Civilizations do not vanish without leaving traces. Yet the traces of Atlantis were buried so deeply that later cultures remembered it only as myth. Why? Because its brilliance had become dangerous. The Atlanteans believed themselves eternal. They mistook their mastery of geometry, astronomy, and spirit for invincibility. They built towers that mirrored the stars, harbors that stretched across oceans, temples that echoed cosmic rhythms. But pride consumed them. Knowledge became spectacle. Wisdom became vanity. Silence was dismissed as emptiness. They sought to bend the cosmos to their will, forgetting that balance sustains and arrogance destroys. When the seas rose and the earth trembled, Atlantis collapsed. Yet collapse alone does not explain erasure. The memory of Atlantis was deliberately disguised, hidden in myth, preserved in fragments. Thoth, the eternal scribe, understood that humanity was not ready to hold such truths openly. He carried fragments of wisdom across collapse, but he sealed them in silence, disguised them in ritual, preserved them in geometry. Atlantis was erased, not because it was forgotten, but because it was hidden. The erasure was protection. If humanity had remembered Atlantis too clearly, it might have repeated its mistakes too quickly. Knowledge without humility becomes weapon. Wisdom without silence becomes noise. By disguising Atlantis as myth, Thoth ensured that its warnings would endure quietly, waiting patiently for rediscovery. And so, Atlantis was erased, not by accident, but by design. Its brilliance was too dangerous, its collapse too instructive, its warnings too vital. The legend became memory disguised as myth, whispering across ages, reminding humanity that civilizations collapse when they forget humility, and wisdom endures only when preserved in silence. When Atlantis fell, it seemed as though the ocean swallowed everything, its towers, its harbors, its temples, its pride. Yet not all was lost. Some fragments of knowledge survived, carried across collapse, preserved in silence, disguised in myth. Wisdom has a way of enduring, even when stone crumbles and memory fades. Geometry was one of the survivors. The Atlanteans had mastered proportions that mirrored the cosmos, angles that aligned with stars, and measurements that echoed cycles of nature. These fragments did not vanish with the flood. They reappeared in monuments built centuries later, in pyramids that rose from the sands, in temples that aligned with solstices. Geometry became a language of endurance, whispering truths across ages. Astronomy survived as well. The Atlanteans charted the heavens, mapping stars and cycles, understanding rhythms that bound earth and sky. When their civilization drowned, these charts were not entirely lost. They lived on in myths of constellations, in rituals tied to solstices, in temples aligned with celestial events. The stars carried memory, and humanity preserved fragments of that memory in story and stone. Symbols endured too. The serpent became a sign of renewal, the ibis of clarity, the lion of strength, tempered by wisdom. These were not decorations, but fragments of Atlantis disguised in form. They carried warnings across ages, reminding humanity that pride blinds, silence preserves, balance sustains. Thoth himself became the guardian of surviving knowledge. He gathered fragments, scrolls, tablets, myths, and carried them across collapse. He sealed them in silence, disguised them in ritual, preserved them in geometry. Egypt became the vessel of this preservation, chosen not for spectacle, but for endurance. Its deserts preserved silence, its pyramids aligned with stars, its temples disguised wisdom in ritual. The flood drowned monuments, but it could not drown memory. Knowledge survived, disguised in myth, preserved in silence, waiting patiently for rediscovery. The Hall of Records became the chamber of this endurance, a place where fragments of Atlantis waited quietly, sealed in stone and sand, whispering across ages. And so, knowledge survived the flood, not as spectacle, but as silence. It endured in geometry, astronomy, symbols, and myth. It was carried by Thoth, preserved in Egypt, disguised in ritual. It waits patiently, reminding humanity that wisdom does not vanish with collapse, but endures quietly, sealed in silence, waiting for rediscovery. Before Egypt rose from the sands, before temples echoed with chants and pyramids aligned with stars, Thoth existed as something far older than the god later carved into stone. He was not born in Egypt. He was a survivor of a forgotten age, a witness to Atlantis, a guardian of wisdom carried across collapse. Thoth was not a ruler, nor a king seated upon a throne. He was a scribe, a recorder, a keeper of memory. In Atlantis, he observed the brilliance of geometry, the mastery of astronomy, the arrogance of pride. He watched as towers gleamed with cosmic proportions, as harbors stretched across oceans, as temples echoed with chants of eternity. And he watched as pride consumed it all. When Atlantis drowned, Thoth endured. He carried fragments of wisdom, scrolls of geometry, tablets of cosmic rhythm, myths of cycles, across collapse. He understood that humanity was not ready to hold such truths openly. Knowledge without humility becomes weapon. Wisdom without silence becomes noise. His task was not to dazzle, but to preserve. Before Egypt, Thoth was memory itself. He was the embodiment of endurance, the guardian of fragments, too vast for pride to grasp. He was not worshipped as a god, but remembered as a witness. His role was not to command, but to record. He did not build monuments, but he preserved the wisdom that monuments carried. When Egypt rose, Thoth became more than a witness. He became a symbol. The ibis became his emblem of clarity, the moon his rhythm of cycles, the scribe his eternal role. Yet behind the god carved in stone was the survivor of Atlantis, the guardian of wisdom carried across collapse, the witness of a world erased, who was Thoth before Egypt. He was the memory of Atlantis, the scribe of collapse, the guardian of fragments. He was not a god at first, but a survivor. His task was not to rule, but to preserve. His role was not to dazzle, but to endure. And so, before Egypt rose, Thoth carried wisdom across silence, waiting patiently for humanity to rediscover humility. Thoth's role in the story of Atlantis and Egypt was never that of a king seated upon a throne or a conqueror commanding armies. He was not remembered for ruling lands or leading battles. Instead, he was the quiet observer, the eternal scribe, the one who recorded what others ignored. His power was not in command, but in memory. In Atlantis, Thoth watched as brilliance dazzled its people. He saw towers rise with impossible geometry, harbors stretch across oceans, temples echo with chants of eternity. He witnessed scholars charting stars, priests whispering of cycles, rulers convinced of their invincibility, and he watched as pride consumed it all. When the seas rose and the earth trembled, Thoth did not fight to save Atlantis. He did not rally armies or command ships. He simply observed, recorded, and carried fragments of wisdom across collapse. This is why Thoth was remembered, not as a ruler, but as a witness. His task was not to dazzle, but to preserve. He understood that civilizations collapse when they forget humility, that wisdom must be sealed in silence, that knowledge must be disguised in myth. He carried fragments of Atlantis, geometry, astronomy, cycles, and preserved them in Egypt. He did not rule Egypt, but he became its guardian of wisdom, its scribe of memory, its witness of eternity. The ibis became his emblem of clarity, the moon his rhythm of cycles, the scribe his eternal role. Temples honored him not as a king, but as a recorder. Myths remembered him not as a conqueror, but as a guardian. His strength was not in armies, but in silence. His power was not in command, but in endurance. Thoth's role reminds us that wisdom does not need rulers to endure. It needs witnesses. It needs guardians who preserve fragments across collapse, who disguise truths in myth, who seal memory in silence. Thoth was that witness. He carried the story of Atlantis into Egypt, ensuring that wisdom would survive pride, collapse, and erasure. And so, Thoth stands not as a ruler, but as the eternal scribe. He is the witness of Atlantis's fall, the guardian of Egypt's wisdom, the preserver of truths too vast for pride to grasp. His role was not to command, but to endure. His legacy is not conquest, but memory. Atlantis was not undone by a single wave or a sudden tremor. Its collapse was the slow unraveling of a civilization that believed itself eternal. The Atlanteans had mastered geometry that mirrored the cosmos, astronomy that charted the heavens, and technologies that seemed beyond their age. Their harbors stretched across oceans, their towers gleamed with impossible brilliance, their temples echoed with chants of eternity. Yet beneath this grandeur lay fragility, the fragility of pride. Civilizations fall not because they lack brilliance, but because they forget humility. Atlantis mistook knowledge for permanence, geometry for invincibility, silence for emptiness. Its rulers believed they could bend the cosmos to their will, ignoring the cycles that sustain balance. They built monuments to themselves, dismissed warnings, and consumed wisdom as spectacle. Pride became their crown, and vanity their downfall. The collapse began with imbalance. The earth trembled, the seas rose, the skies darkened. Nature, indifferent to pride, reminded Atlantis that cycles endure, whether civilizations honor them or not. Temples crumbled, towers drowned, harbors vanished. The brilliance of Atlantis dissolved into silence. Yet the fall of Atlantis was not only physical, it was the collapse of memory. Humanity forgot its first world, not because it vanished, but because it was erased. Thoth, the eternal scribe, understood that wisdom must be preserved quietly. He carried fragments of Atlantis, geometry, astronomy, cycles across collapse, sealing them in silence, disguising them in myth, preserving them in Egypt. The fall of Atlantis became legend, remembered not as history but as myth. Yet behind the myth was memory, and behind the memory was warning. Civilizations collapse when they forget humility, when they misuse wisdom, when they chase power without balance. Atlantis was the first great reminder of this truth. And so, the fall of an advanced civilization was not simply the drowning of towers, but the erasure of pride. It was the reminder that brilliance without humility is fragile, that silence preserves what vanity destroys, that balance sustains what arrogance consumes. Atlantis fell, but its warning endures, whispering across ages, waiting patiently for humanity to rediscover humility. The memory of Atlantis did not vanish because the ocean swallowed its towers or because the tremors shattered its temples. Humanity forgot its first world because forgetting was easier than remembering. To recall Atlantis in full would have meant carrying the weight of its collapse, the shame of its pride, and the warning of its arrogance. And so, memory was disguised as myth, softened into story, and buried beneath time. Civilizations that rose after Atlantis carried fragments of its wisdom, geometry, astronomy, symbols, but they did not carry its name. They built monuments that mirrored the stars, temples that echoed cosmic rhythms, myths that whispered of floods and cycles. Yet they spoke of gods and legends, not of Atlantis. The truth was too heavy, too dangerous, too humbling. Thoth understood this forgetting. He preserved fragments of wisdom, but he disguised them in ritual, sealed them in silence, encoded them in geometry. He knew that humanity was not ready to hold such truths openly. Knowledge without humility becomes weapon. Wisdom without silence becomes noise. Forgetting was not punishment, but protection. Humanity forgot its first world because pride prefers myth to memory. Myths can be dismissed, entertained, or reshaped. Memory demands humility. To remember Atlantis would have meant admitting that brilliance collapses, that pride blinds, that silence preserves. Humanity chose myth, and Atlantis became legend. Yet forgetting does not erase. The memory of Atlantis lingers in symbols, whispers in myths, endures in geometry. It waits patiently, disguised in silence, preserved in fragments, reminding humanity that civilizations collapse when they forget humility, and wisdom endures only when preserved in silence. And so, humanity forgot its first world, not because it vanished, but because it was hidden. Atlantis became legend, Thoth became guardian, Egypt became vessel. The memory waits quietly, sealed in stone and sand, whispering across ages, waiting patiently for rediscovery. Atlantis did not vanish into nothingness. It became memory disguised as myth, a story retold so often that its truth blurred into legend. Civilizations that rose after its collapse carried fragments of its wisdom, but they spoke of gods, floods, and forgotten ages rather than naming Atlantis outright. To call it myth was safer than to admit it was memory. The flood stories of Mesopotamia, the deluge myths of Greece, the whispers of lost lands across cultures, all were echoes of Atlantis. They were not inventions, but recollections softened into tales. Humanity remembered, but it remembered in disguise. Pride prefers myth to memory, because myth can be dismissed, reshaped, or entertained. Memory demands humility, and humility was too heavy for civilizations eager to crown themselves eternal. Thoth understood this transformation. He carried fragments of Atlantis across collapse, but he sealed them in silence, disguised them in ritual, preserved them in geometry. He knew that humanity was not ready to hold such truths openly. Knowledge without humility becomes weapon. Wisdom without silence becomes noise. By allowing Atlantis to become myth, he ensured that its warnings would endure quietly, waiting patiently for rediscovery. Egypt became the vessel of this disguised memory. Its pyramids mirrored the stars. Its temples echoed cosmic rhythms. Its myths carried warnings of floods and cycles. Symbols like the serpent, the ibis, and the lion were not mere decorations, but fragments of Atlantis disguised in form. They carried memory across ages, whispering truths too vast for pride to grasp. Atlantis as myth is entertaining. Atlantis as memory is humbling. The difference lies in readiness. Humanity chose myth because it was easier, but the memory lingers, waiting patiently in silence. The Hall of Records, hidden within Egypt's framework, became the chamber of this endurance, a place where fragments of Atlantis wait quietly, sealed in stone and sand, whispering across ages. And so, Atlantis endures not as myth alone, but as memory disguised. It whispers across cultures, preserved in symbols, disguised in rituals, waiting patiently for humanity to rediscover humility. Atlantis is not gone. It is remembered in silence, preserved in fragments, waiting for the day when humanity is ready to see myth as memory. When Atlantis drowned beneath the rising seas, Thoth did not vanish with it. He endured, carrying fragments of wisdom across collapse, walking silently through the ruins of a world erased. His journey was not one of conquest, but of preservation. He did not lead armies or rebuild cities. He carried memory itself, disguised in myth, sealed in silence, waiting patiently for humanity to rediscover humility. Thoth's journey began with silence. He gathered scrolls of geometry, tablets of cosmic rhythm, myths of cycles, and carried them away from the drowned towers of Atlantis. He understood that humanity was not ready to hold such truths openly. Knowledge without humility becomes weapon. Wisdom without silence becomes noise. His task was not to dazzle, but to preserve. He traveled across lands scarred by collapse, through deserts that preserved silence, across mountains that whispered endurance. Wherever he went, he disguised fragments of wisdom in ritual, sealed truths in geometry, preserved memory in myth. He became the eternal scribe, recording what others ignored, carrying fragments too vast for pride to grasp. Egypt became the destination of his journey. Its deserts preserved silence, its stars aligned with pyramids yet to rise. Its people carried myths of floods and cycles. Thoth chose Egypt not for spectacle, but for endurance. he sealed fragments of Atlantis within its framework, disguised wisdom in temples, preserved memory in symbols. The ibis became his emblem of clarity, the moon his rhythm of cycles, the scribe his eternal role. Thoth's journey after the collapse was not about ruling, but about witnessing. He did not seek power, but preservation. He did not command, but recorded. He did not dazzle, but endured. His journey was the bridge between Atlantis and Egypt, between collapse and endurance, between pride and humility. And so, Thoth's journey after the collapse reminds us that wisdom does not vanish with stone. It endures in silence, disguised in myth, preserved in geometry. Thoth carried fragments across ages, ensuring that humanity would one day rediscover humility. His journey was not conquest, but endurance, not spectacle, but preservation, not rule, but witness. When Atlantis drowned beneath the waves, Thoth carried fragments of its wisdom across collapse. He did not scatter them randomly, nor did he entrust them to lands that lacked endurance. He chose Egypt deliberately, not as the beginning of civilization, but as the continuation of memory. Egypt was not selected for spectacle, but for silence. The deserts of Egypt preserved what oceans could not. Sand does not swallow monuments as the sea does. It buries them gently, keeping them intact beneath time. The silence of Egypt became the perfect vessel for wisdom too dangerous to repeat. Its skies were clear, its stars visible, its rhythms steady. Here, geometry could be preserved in pyramids, astronomy in alignments, myths in ritual. Egypt was chosen because it could endure. Egypt's people carried myths of floods and cycles, echoes of collapses remembered faintly from ages past. They were not dazzled by pride alone. They understood the importance of balance, of ritual, of silence. Thoth saw in them the potential to guard fragments of Atlantis without consuming them as spectacle. He disguised wisdom in their temples, encoded memory in their symbols, preserved fragments in their rituals. The Nile itself mirrored the cycles of Atlantis. Its floods rose and fell, sustaining life, reminding humanity of rhythms that endure beyond pride. Egypt's monuments mirrored the stars. Its temples echoed cosmic harmonies. Its myths carried warnings disguised as stories. Egypt became the guardian of fragments, too vast for pride to grasp. Why Egypt was chosen is clear. It was not the first, but the continuation. It was not spectacle, but endurance. It was not brilliance, but silence. Thoth sealed fragments of Atlantis within Egypt's framework, ensuring that wisdom would survive collapse, pride, and erasure. Egypt became the vessel of memory, the guardian of fragments, the continuation of a world erased. And so, Egypt was chosen not by chance, but by design. Its deserts preserved silence. Its stars aligned with pyramids. Its people carried myths of cycles. Thoth entrusted Egypt with fragments of Atlantis, ensuring that wisdom would endure quietly, waiting patiently for humanity to rediscover humility. Not all wisdom carried from Atlantis was meant to be remembered. Some knowledge was preserved only in fragments, hidden deliberately, because to reveal it fully would have been to invite collapse once more. The Atlanteans had reached heights of brilliance, but their downfall proved that brilliance without humility becomes peril. They had mastered energies that bent nature to their will, geometries that mirrored the cosmos, and sciences that blurred the line between spirit and matter. These achievements dazzled, but they also destabilized. Power without balance becomes destruction, and Atlantis proved this truth. When the seas rose and the earth trembled, it was not only nature that consumed them, it was their own misuse of knowledge. Thoth, the eternal scribe, understood this danger. He carried fragments of wisdom across collapse, but he sealed the most perilous truths in silence. He disguised them in myth, encoded them in symbols, preserved them in rituals. Egypt became the vessel of this preservation, chosen not to repeat Atlantis, but to guard against its mistakes. The pyramids aligned with stars, but they did not reveal the full geometry of Atlantis. Temples echoed cosmic rhythms, but they disguised truths too vast for pride to grasp. Knowledge too dangerous to repeat was not lost, but hidden. It was preserved in silence, waiting patiently for humanity to rediscover humility. The Hall of Records became the chamber of this endurance, a place where fragments of Atlantis wait quietly, sealed in stone and sand, whispering across ages. The danger lies not in knowledge itself, but in its misuse. Civilizations collapse when they chase power without balance, when they consume wisdom as spectacle, when they dismiss humility as weakness. Atlantis proved this truth, and Thoth ensured that humanity would not repeat it too quickly. And so, knowledge too dangerous to repeat remains hidden. It is not punishment, but protection. It is not denial, but preservation. It is not loss, but endurance. The fragments wait quietly, disguised in myth, preserved in silence, reminding humanity that wisdom must be approached with humility, or it becomes peril. When the fragments of Atlantis were carried into Egypt, they did not remain as raw knowledge alone. They transformed into something deeper, something enduring, something sacred. This was the birth of sacred wisdom, the moment when memory became ritual, when geometry became temple, when silence became teacher. The Atlanteans had once used knowledge as spectacle, dazzling themselves with towers and harbors, convinced of their invincibility. But Thoth understood that wisdom must be disguised, softened, and preserved. In Egypt, he encoded fragments of Atlantis into symbols, rituals, and myths. What had once been science became sacred practice. What had once been geometry became divine architecture. What had once been astronomy became the rhythm of gods. The pyramids rose not only as monuments, but as guardians. Their sides aligned with stars. Their angles whispered cosmic harmonies. Their stones carried fragments of memory. Temples disguised wisdom in ritual. Myths carried warnings in story. Silence preserved truths too vast for pride to grasp. The ibis became a symbol of clarity, the serpent of renewal, the lion of strength tempered by wisdom. These were not decorations, but fragments of Atlantis disguised in sacred form. Sacred wisdom was born because knowledge alone had proven dangerous. Atlantis collapsed when brilliance was consumed by pride. Egypt endured because wisdom was disguised in ritual, preserved in silence, softened into myth. Sacred wisdom was not spectacle, but endurance. It was not brilliance, but balance. It was not arrogance, but humility. The birth of sacred wisdom ensured that fragments of Atlantis would survive collapse. They would whisper across ages, reminding humanity that civilizations collapse when they forget humility, and wisdom endures only when preserved in silence. Sacred wisdom became the vessel of endurance, the guardian of fragments, the continuation of a world erased. And so, sacred wisdom was born, not as invention, but as preservation. It was the transformation of Atlantis's brilliance into Egypt's endurance, the disguise of dangerous truths into ritual, the preservation of memory into myth. Sacred wisdom endures quietly, waiting patiently for humanity to rediscover humility. The wisdom of Atlantis did not vanish entirely with the flood. It was carried forward, preserved in fragments, disguised in symbols, and sealed in silence. Yet the most important question remains: why was this ancient knowledge hidden? Why did Thoth, the eternal scribe, choose concealment over revelation? The answer lies in the danger of memory without humility. Atlantis had proven that brilliance alone is fragile. Its people mastered geometry that mirrored the cosmos, astronomy that charted the heavens, and sciences that blurred the line between spirit and matter. But they consumed wisdom as spectacle, mistook knowledge for permanence, and dismissed silence as emptiness. Their collapse was not caused by ignorance, but by arrogance. Thoth understood that humanity was not ready to hold such truths openly. Knowledge without humility becomes weapon, wisdom without silence becomes noise. To reveal the full brilliance of Atlantis would have been to invite its collapse once more. And so, he chose concealment. He disguised fragments in ritual, encoded truths in symbols, preserved memory in myth. Egypt became the vessel of this preservation, chosen not to repeat Atlantis, but to guard against its mistakes. The pyramids aligned with stars, but they did not reveal the full geometry of Atlantis. Temples echoed cosmic rhythms, but they disguised truths too vast for pride to grasp. Myths carried warnings, but they softened them into stories. Symbols like the ibis, serpent, and lion were not mere decorations, but fragments of Atlantis, disguised in sacred form. Ancient knowledge was hidden not as punishment, but as protection. It was not denied, but preserved. It was not lost, but sealed in silence. The Hall of Records became the chamber of this endurance, a place where fragments of Atlantis wait quietly, whispering across ages, reminding humanity that readiness is not brilliance, but balance. And so, ancient knowledge was hidden because humanity was not ready. It waits patiently, disguised in myth, preserved in silence, sealed in stone and sand. It endures quietly, reminding us that civilizations collapse when they forget humility, and wisdom survives only when preserved in silence. Atlantis may have drowned beneath the waves, but its voice did not fall silent. Its echoes carried forward, disguised in stone, preserved in ritual, and whispered through myth. Egypt became the vessel of these echoes, chosen not to repeat Atlantis, but to preserve fragments of its wisdom in ways humanity could endure. The pyramids themselves are the most striking echoes. Their sides align with stars, their angles mirror cosmic harmonies. Their proportions whisper the geometry once perfected in Atlantis. They are not merely tombs, but guardians of memory, monuments that carry fragments of a world erased. Each stone is a syllable in a language of endurance, each alignment a reminder of cycles that bind earth and sky. Temples to carried echoes, their rituals disguised fragments of cosmic truth, their chants preserved warnings in story. Their symbols encoded memory in form. The ibis, sacred to Thoth, became a symbol of clarity, the serpent of renewal, the lion of strength, tempered by wisdom. These were not decorations, but echoes of Atlantis, disguised in sacred form. Even myths carried fragments. Flood stories whispered of collapse, cycles of gods mirrored cosmic rhythms. tales of rebirth, disguised warnings of pride undone. Egypt's myths were not inventions, but echoes of Atlantis, softened into legend, preserved in silence, waiting patiently for rediscovery. The Hall of Records, hidden within Egypt's framework, became the chamber of these echoes. It was not treasure, but memory, not spectacle, but preservation, not loss, but endurance. Within its silence, fragments of Atlantis wait quietly, whispering across ages, reminding humanity that readiness is not brilliance, but balance. Echoes of Atlantis in Egypt remind us that wisdom does not vanish with collapse. It endures in silence, disguised in ritual, preserved in geometry. Atlantis lives on not as myth alone, but as memory disguised in Egypt's monuments, temples, and myths. The echoes whisper across ages, waiting patiently for humanity to rediscover humility. When monuments crumble and cities drown, symbols endure. They are the quiet survivors of collapse, carrying fragments of wisdom across ages, whispering truths too vast for pride to erase. Atlantis may have vanished beneath the waves, and Egypt may have risen from the sands, but their symbols outlived them both. The serpent is one such survivor. In Atlantis, it represented renewal, the endless cycle of life and death, collapse and rebirth. In Egypt, it became the uraeus, the sacred cobra upon the brow of kings, a reminder that power must be tempered by wisdom. The serpent endured not as decoration, but as memory disguised in form. The ibis carried clarity across ages. Sacred to Thoth, it symbolized precision, balance, and the scribe's eternal role. In Egypt, the ibis became the emblem of wisdom, the bird that walked along the Nile's edge, reminding humanity that silence preserves what pride destroys. The lion roared across civilizations as strength tempered by wisdom. In Atlantis, it embodied guardianship. In Egypt, it became Sekhmet, the fierce protector, a reminder that power without balance consumes itself. The lion endured as a symbol of vigilance, whispering across ages that civilizations collapse when they forget humility. Stars themselves became symbols. The Atlanteans charted constellations, aligning monuments with cosmic rhythms. Egypt mirrored this practice, aligning pyramids with Orion, temples with solstices, monuments with celestial cycles. The stars carried memory across ages, reminding humanity that cycles endure whether civilizations honor them or not. Symbols outlived civilizations because they were disguised in form, softened into ritual, preserved in silence. They carried fragments of Atlantis into Egypt, ensuring that wisdom would endure collapse, pride, and erasure. The Hall of Records itself became a symbol, not of treasure, but of endurance, a chamber where fragments wait quietly, sealed in stone and sand, whispering across ages. And so, symbols remind us that wisdom does not vanish with stone. It endures in silence, disguised in form, preserved in ritual. Civilizations collapse, but symbols whisper across ages, waiting patiently for humanity to rediscover humility. Not all fragments of Atlantis survived the flood. Some knowledge was carried forward, disguised in ritual, preserved in geometry, sealed in silence. But much was lost forever, swallowed by the sea, erased by collapse, dissolved into memory too fragile to endure. The monuments themselves were among the losses. Towers that gleamed with impossible brilliance, harbors that stretched across oceans, temples that echoed cosmic rhythms, all drowned beneath rising waters. Their stones dissolved, their alignments vanished, their grandeur erased. Unlike Egypt's pyramids, Atlantis's monuments left no guardians, no survivors, no echoes. They were consumed entirely, leaving only whispers in myth. The sciences of Atlantis were lost to energies that bent nature to their will, technologies that blurred the line between spirit and matter, geometries that unlocked cosmic rhythms. These were not carried forward. Thoth preserved fragments, but the full brilliance was too dangerous, too fragile, too bound to pride. Humanity was not ready, and so the most advanced knowledge of Atlantis was erased, leaving only fragments disguised in Egypt's temples and myths. The memory of daily life vanished as well. The voices of its people, the rhythms of its streets, the songs of its rituals, the stories of its families, all drowned without record. Civilizations are remembered by their monuments, but their humanity is often lost. Atlantis's brilliance dazzled, but its people vanished into silence, leaving no trace of their laughter, their sorrow, their ordinary lives. What was lost forever was not only stone and science, but humility itself. Atlantis believed eternity belonged to them. They mistook knowledge for permanence, geometry for invincibility, silence for emptiness. Their collapse was not only physical, but spiritual. The humility they lacked was erased with them, leaving humanity to rediscover it slowly, painfully, across ages. And so, Atlantis reminds us that not all wisdom endures. Some fragments survive, disguised in myth, preserved in silence, but much is lost forever. Monuments swallowed, sciences erased, voices silenced. What remains is warning. Civilizations collapse when they forget humility, and wisdom endures only when preserved in silence. Atlantis's brilliance dazzled, but its arrogance consumed it, leaving humanity with fragments and whispers, while the rest was lost forever. The brilliance of Atlantis was dazzling, but brilliance always carries a cost. Advanced knowledge is never free. It demands balance, humility, and responsibility. When those are forgotten, the price becomes collapse. Atlantis paid that price in full. The Atlanteans mastered sciences that bent nature to their will, geometries that mirrored the cosmos, and energies that blurred the line between spirit and matter. Their towers gleamed, their harbors stretched across oceans, their temples echoed cosmic rhythms. Yet the more they advanced, the more they believed themselves eternal. Knowledge became spectacle. Wisdom became vanity. Silence was dismissed as emptiness. Pride consumed them, and pride is the most dangerous cost of all. The price of advanced knowledge is imbalance. When civilizations chase power without humility, they destabilize the very cycles that sustain them. Atlantis ignored this truth. Its brilliance dazzled, but its arrogance blinded. The seas rose, the earth trembled, the skies darkened. Nature reminded them that cycles endure, whether civilizations honor them or not. Thoth understood this price. He carried fragments of wisdom across collapse, but he sealed the most dangerous truths in silence. He disguised them in ritual, encoded them in symbols, preserved them in geometry. Egypt became the vessel of this preservation, chosen not to repeat Atlantis, but to guard against its mistakes. The pyramids aligned with stars, but they did not reveal the full geometry of Atlantis. Temples echoed cosmic rhythms, but they disguised truths too vast for pride to grasp. The price of advanced knowledge is not collapse alone, but erasure. Humanity forgot Atlantis, not because it vanished, but because it was hidden. To remember fully would have been to risk repeating its mistakes too quickly. Knowledge without humility becomes weapon. Wisdom without silence becomes noise. The erasure was protection. The forgetting was preservation. And so, the price of advanced knowledge is clear. Brilliance without humility collapses. Wisdom without silence vanishes. Power without balance consumes itself. Atlantis paid this price, and its memory was disguised as myth. What remains is warning. Civilizations collapse when they forget humility, and wisdom endures only when preserved in silence. Humanity does not suffer from ignorance alone. It suffers from forgetting. The collapse of Atlantis was not simply the drowning of towers or the erasure of monuments. It was the loss of memory itself. What humanity once knew, it chose to forget. What it once carried, it buried beneath myth. What it once lived, it disguised as legend. The forgotten past is not empty. It is filled with fragments of brilliance, geometries that mirrored the cosmos, sciences that blurred spirit and matter, rituals that aligned with cycles of nature. These fragments survived in silence, but the whole was erased. Humanity remembered floods, gods, and myths, but it forgot Atlantis. It remembered fragments of wisdom, but it forgot the civilization that carried them. Forgetting was not accident, but protection. Thoth understood that humanity was not ready to hold such truths openly. Knowledge without humility becomes weapon. Wisdom without silence becomes noise. He carried fragments across collapse, but he sealed them in silence, disguised them in ritual, preserved them in geometry. Egypt became the vessel of this preservation, chosen not to repeat Atlantis, but to guard against its mistakes. Humanity's forgotten past whispers in myths of floods, in temples aligned with stars, in symbols disguised as gods. The serpent, the ibis, the lion, all fragments of Atlantis, disguised in sacred form. The pyramids themselves are echoes of a geometry once perfected, monuments that whisper of a world erased. Yet humanity calls them mysteries, forgetting that they are memories. The forgotten past is not gone. It lingers in silence, disguised in myth, preserved in fragments. It waits patiently, reminding humanity that civilizations collapse when they forget humility, and wisdom endures only when preserved in silence. Atlantis was humanity's first world, erased deliberately, remembered only in fragments, waiting patiently for rediscovery. And so, humanity's forgotten past is not emptiness, but silence. It is not loss, but disguise. It is not myth, but memory. The past waits quietly, sealed in stone and sand, whispering across ages, reminding humanity that forgetting is protection, but remembering is destiny. Atlantis was humanity's first great world, dazzling in brilliance, unmatched in mastery, and consumed by pride. Its towers gleamed with impossible geometry. Its harbors stretched across oceans. Its temples echoed cosmic rhythms. It was a civilization that believed itself eternal. Yet eternity does not belong to pride. When the seas rose and the earth trembled, Atlantis collapsed. Its monuments drowned. Its sciences vanished. Its voices silenced. Fragments survived. Geometry disguised in pyramids. Astronomy preserved in alignments. Wisdom sealed in myth. But the world itself was gone. Atlantis was erased not only by flood, but by design. Thoth carried fragments across collapse, but he sealed the most dangerous truths in silence. Humanity was not ready, and so the world was hidden. The world that will never return is Atlantis itself. Its brilliance dazzled, but its arrogance consumed it. Its monuments are gone, its sciences erased, its voices silenced. What remains are echoes, pyramids aligned with stars, myths of floods and cycles, symbols disguised in sacred form. Atlantis endures not as world, but as memory, not as history, but as warning, not as spectacle, but as silence. And so Atlantis reminds us that some worlds are not meant to return. They collapse when pride blinds. They vanish when arrogance consumes. They endure only as fragments disguised in myth. The world that will never return waits quietly in silence, whispering across ages, reminding humanity that civilizations collapse when they forget humility. And wisdom survives only when preserved in silence. The story now drifts into quiet. The echoes of Atlantis fade like distant waves. The symbols rest in silence. The fragments wait patiently in stone and sand. The world that will never return has spoken its warning, and the night carries it gently into memory. Good night.